June. So we're going to be working on calendar events beyond that. I would say if anybody would like to help us out, we're a very hands-on and sleeves rolled up organization. So just give your card or let any of the volunteer coordinators know about what about your interest. We'll be sure to get you plugged in terms of that regard. So with no further ado, let me introduce Bill, who'll talk about a great panel I have for you tonight. And hopefully when you come out of here, you'll be all ready and set to, start your own business empires. Bill.
We trust you already have a business empire, you're just expanding the borders. Though there is a problem dealing with empires, the United States has been anti-colonial ever since our foundation. So we're not entirely in favor of empires per se. But moving forward, we are not particularly international in the title this evening, but I would note that we've got a lot of international experience on this panel, from Canada to Japan, from Germany to Australia. If you have a deal that requires attention on more than one different market, and nowadays the world is the market for most middle market companies, our panelists should be able to talk. I know that there are others in this room who also routinely work both abroad and here in deal structuring. Joe McCall, who helped put together our private equity panel. Joe, stand up a second and take a little bit of credit. For the 6th year in a row, that is why his hair is gray, it was dark and black when I remember to begin with. Worked in Japan for numerous years, and we're now enjoying further Japanese activity together. I don't know whether Japanese activity is a filthy thing, but I don't think so. I think it's a good thing. Anyway, moving forward, lawyers, by the by, should never be allowed to tell jokes, ever. Nevertheless, we have for you a panel that is going to try to give you deal problems from start to finish. And we are not trying to give you a legal presentation. That would take 15 hours and would put me to sleep, much less anybody else. We're going to start with Ellen Huxtable, who will talk about the analysis that a company should do, probably 2 to 3 years at least, before doing a transaction. Lawyers call this clearing the underbrush. You can call it optimizing the company. But there are many, many things that a privately held company can do to significantly change that company's positioning, both for equity and for sales markets. And there are things that a buyer can do to position their company to be ready with a team that can actually take advantage of opportunities. With Pat Grandel, we have a business broker who has both operational experience and significant brokerage experience. Sun Acquisitions is by the largest brokerage operation, I believe, in the Chicago metro area. And they have 2 different offices. They never do talk to each other, but they do have 2 different offices. There is better biomaterial on each of our speakers than I'm giving you, by the by, in the handout. Colleen Ryan, I can tell you, is an excellent speaker. She made me understand arithmetic last week when she and Dave Gay did a presentation on how to do analysis of whether or not a company can afford to take on financing. And she has a couple of decades of experience in U.S. Small Business Administration guaranteed lending programs. These are much more in use nowadays for 2 reasons. 1, the money is cheap. 2, the limits have been significantly increased over the last couple of years, so that the range of deals that it is possible to do using bank financing is much higher. And since money, as my capital people don't like to admit, but I will tell them regularly anyway, is a fungible commodity. $1 is worth another dollar. You should rent money for your deals at as low a rate as it is possible to arrange, if you can convince the lender to go with you. More on that next month. John Swanson has a distinction that the rest of your panel does not. He actually belongs here since he is a Booth graduate. More to the point, many, many deals fail for the wrong reasons. They fail because of ego. They fail because there are glitches in the negotiation process. They fail because there's not a professional team on one side or another, often on the acquisition transaction particularly. The acquired company will be doing a deal that is the first time they've ever been in a buy, sell, or recap mode in the founder's life. And so the habits of 20 years of working on green pieces of paper, the tiny contracts and tiny family deals can get in the way of a professional result. And John will give us some ideas as to how to achieve agreement on the objective and reasonable factors without getting hung up on inappropriate pieces as you proceed to a closing. With that, I'll turn the mic and the podium over to Ellen. And we have her PowerPoint up so you can look at how to go about selling a business.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to stand over here because if I stood behind the podium, you'd get this talking head effect, right? Like this, you know? And that just won't work, so I'll give you a little bit more. Thank you all for being here tonight, and I'm going to be the lead-off speaker, setting the ground rules a little bit, giving some of the background for selling a business. Now, buying a business is the other side, and that's another topic. We're going to talk about selling a business. 3 things that I'm going to talk about in selling your business: the decision considerations, planning the sale, and then preparing the sale. Decision considerations. One of the things that's really important to think about is what is your agenda. Everybody that's selling a business has a different agenda. You might think you have the only agenda there is, but there's a lot of things that go into this as a decision. What are your goals? You're going to have financial goals, but you're also going to have other goals, perhaps. And those are going to make the deal more complicated. They're going to make your choice of who you want to seriously consider a much more difficult and complex choice. What is going to be your financial goals, your legacy? What is going to be your next project? What you put on the table is going to be a function of where you see yourself going next. And finally, what kind of commitments do you have? Have you made commitments, verbal, nonverbal, personal, business, to other interested parties? That also might be a factor that's going to change how you approach this new sale that you want to do. Timing. There's 2 kinds of timing here. There's the timing that is your personal timing. Do you want to retire? Do you want to go to Florida? Do you want to start a new business? And there's also the market timing. What is going on in the marketplace? What's going on in the economy? What's going on in your industry? Is this the right time for you to sell, or is it not? What looks like it could be a very simple decision process can get to be very complicated because of these things. Decision in the marketplace. There's going to be a whole spectrum of potential purchasers, and they're going to have different goals and different intentions. When you get down to a specific candidate, or a couple of specific candidates, they're also going to have very specific intentions. And that's something that you're going to need to consider when you decide if this is the right person to buy. If you're in it only for the cash up front, the money, then the decision is very simple. But quite often, if it's your business that you've grown and nurtured, that's not the only thing you really have in your mind. So how do you get through the marketplace? One of the things to think about is using advisors. You have them all around you, and they're willing to give you advice and help. People often don't ask them. It's sort of like when I was having my first baby, and I went to the doctor, and I was about out to here, said, "And what would you like to do? How would you like to go about this?" And I looked at the doctor, and I said, "You know, one of us has a whole mess of experience at birthing babies, and one of us has 0 experience. So if you tell me what you think might be a bright idea, I'll probably say, good idea." The same thing in selling a business. The people around you have a lot of experience. You can ask them. You don't necessarily have to do what they suggest, but ask them and get their opinions, get their input, because that's what they're there for. In planning the sale, start early. As Bill alluded to, One of the things that is important is getting the business in the best possible shape to sell. The analogy on this one is selling a house. If I wanted to sell my house today, I would be cleaning like a maniac. I would be taking all those dents that my son put in the walls when he was throwing baseballs against them, and I would be fixing them. I wouldn't be trying to sell my house the way it is now, because I know that I wouldn't get what it's worth. Same thing with the business, except the business is probably worth a lot more than my house, even with the dents all fixed. Identify every asset. In today's marketplace, you're going to have assets that you haven't thought about. You might think about the building, you might think about the book of business, you might think about the Rolodex. Maybe you have a really cool phone number. Maybe it's like Hudson 32700 and everybody knows it. I know some of you probably are way too young and you weren't born yet when they had Hudson 32700. But it was a phone number that everybody in Chicago knew. You will also have other assets that are more contemporary. You're going to have a website. I knew a company that got into a huge argument over who got the web address. It was worth big money, especially in today's day and age when all the really good web addresses are taken. If you have a really good web address, that's worth money to the right person. To somebody else, it might not be worth something. Again, this is where who you're selling to gets to be a very important thing. Decide what is and what is not on the block. If you're going to go into a similar business, you might not want to put everything on the block. You also might have certain things that are of a personal nature. I know somebody that's planning to sell a business. In that case, he wants to sell his list of contacts. He wants to sell his book of business. He doesn't want to sell the name. The name has family importance to him. He wants to open up another business with a similar name. That's his choice. But what you put on the block is going to influence the price you get and who is going to be the purchaser that's going to be most interested. Preparing to sell. Communicate to stakeholders. This is really important. Again, if you are starting to prepare your business for sale, the people around you are going to notice. Your vendors, your customers, but most importantly, your staff is going to notice. When do you tell them? And what do you tell them? That's a really specific decision that you have to make for your company. If you tell them too soon in a way that upsets them, in a way that causes anguish, you might find that the value of your business is diminished. On the other hand, you don't want them to find out from a third party what's going on, because that can be devastating. So that's something you need to think through, you need to strategize, you need to make sure that the value you have in your staff is preserved and ideally enhanced. When you share information with your staff, address their concerns. They're going to have concerns. Know the answers. If you don't know the answers, be honest. Say, I don't know that. You've raised a good point. I need to think about that. And above all, don't make any promises, because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know that something that you say now with every intent to fulfill is going to be something that for one reason or another you can't fulfill. And when you do that, your credibility is lost. And it's not just with the people you've told, it's with everybody else that they know, it's with everybody else in your industry. So don't make any promises. Preparing to sell, show your business at its best. Again, it's like selling your house. Make it look like nobody lives in your house when you're ready to sell it, right? I mean, the faucets are perfectly polished. There's nothing on the kitchen counter. There's no toys. There's no Legos on the family room floor. The same thing with your business, but not only with the physical things that you see, also with the guts of the business, also with your books, also with your processes, your procedures, also with everything that's part of that business. It's not just that the floor is washed. The floor should be washed. But it's also with everything that that potential buyer is going to look at. It needs to look perfect. And you need to know what's in it, too. Clean up, look sharp. Invest wisely. Just like when you sell a house, you want to make an investment. You want to make small investments that are going to pay off. Same thing with your business. Think about what you need to polish up, what you need to strengthen, and think about making those very specific investments in your business because that's going to help raise its ultimate value. And finally, get an outside opinion. Get somebody that you know, like, and trust to come walking through your business and take a look, as though they were the buyer. Ask them to take a look. Do they understand your procedures? Do they understand your business? Is this something that they see something that you don't see? Something that can be very small, that's going to turn off a potential buyer. Ask somebody to give you fresh eyes on this deal. Preparing to sell, have substance. Document your processes. If you're in a business and you're selling the business because you have a strong process, document it. The process in your head or in your bookkeeper's head or in your office manager's head is worth nothing. Because the minute you walk out the door or your office manager doesn't like the new owners and quits, it's worth zero. And a smart potential buyer knows that. So document everything. Make sure the documentation is complete. Make sure that it's clear and understandable and somebody can actually do it. Know what is transferable. Not everything in the company might be transferable. The one thing that I can think of that might not be transferable would be email addresses. You might have a permission-based email list that you've used and your customers have agreed to. If the purchaser of your company tries to use that list with their name on it, they will probably get marked as a spammer. And so that's something that you need to think about. What is going to be transferable and what is not? Make the intangible tangible. Something that exists in your head is worth nothing. Something that exists on paper, something that exists and is documented, that has value. And you're looking for every single thing you can find that's going to be of value to whoever your purchaser is. And finally, know your financials. One of the things that is very difficult in any kind of negotiation is when the owner of the business says, well, I don't know about that. Let me talk to my accountant, or let me talk to my lawyer, or let me talk to my banker, or let me talk to my office manager. If you're in that kind of a position, you have lost a lot of your leverage. So know your financials, know what's going on in your business so that you can present it in its best light and so that you can answer questions authoritatively. Because if you can't answer them authoritatively, you're going to lose credibility in the negotiation. You're going to let people see points that they might be able to manipulate to their credit. So be obviously awesome. When you're preparing to sell, be obviously awesome. Gather key indicators. Know where you stand in relationship to the marketplace. Know what the ratios are for your industry and know where your ratios are, because that's a selling point. That's something that's tangible. That's better than saying, well, we're in the top 50% or the top 20%. Prove it. If you have your ratios out there, you can prove that and document it and quantify it. Use graphs and summaries because some people are visual. Make it really easy for somebody to see why your business is such a great value. Show off. This is not the time to be shy. This is not the time to be selfie-facing. It's not the time to lie either. But present your business in its very, very best light. This is something to be proud of. This is something that's worthwhile. It's valuable. And so show it off. And make and substantiate projections. So people are buying your business for what it's going to do in the future. You know what that future is. You know your industry, you know your niche, you know your business better than anyone. Make projections. Tell them that based upon your knowledge of your industry, your business, your niche, here's where you see it going in the next 1 or 3 or 5 or 10 years. Make sure those projections are based in reality. Make sure you can defend them, but help the person see the future and the vision that you can see for your company. So in summary, plan ahead, know your goals, look sharp and be sharp, make the intangible tangible because that's what you're selling, and plan for transition because a poorly planned transition can be devastating to the value and to your credibility in the marketplace. In most cases, price isn't everything. You might think I'm going to get the highest price for my business, but think about the other factors that are involved there as well, because price often isn't everything. and don't assume anything. I've known more than one deal that there are many assurances up front. Oh, yes, we want to continue, we want to keep your staff. We want to do the right thing for your staff. We want to make you we want to make your business a co-partner with ours in the industry. And as soon as the ink was on the paper, all of those things were forgotten. And I've seen that happen more than once. So whatever you're going to agree to, get it in writing. Don't assume anything. And finally, live long and prosper. Enjoy your new life, your life without your business or with your new business. I thank you very much, and I'm turning the microphone back over to Bill.
As a frequent watcher of all various generations of this, we all have to simply repeat a sign indicating we actually closed, which is a good thing. Okay, Pat Grandel is now going to give us material, which is, by the way, proprietary, so take notes, and improving value as well as talking about the business. I'll let Pat start introducing the material, and I'll get the PowerPoint up.
You will get the PowerPoint going. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm Pat Grandel. Oops, excuse me. I'm the Business Development Director for Sun Acquisitions. I am a business broker as well. So I focus on helping people buy and grow and sell businesses. So as soon as the slide gets up, that will kind of show what's going on there. And I specialize in a broad range of sizes and industries. And as Bill mentioned before, we have 2 locations in Chicago. My office, which is by O'Hare Airport, and we have a downtown location, which is right by the East Bank Club. Oops. Oop, there we go. Overview and goals for today. I want to talk a little bit about exit planning thoughts, the current market, buyers and what they want, determining value, and I want to also go over some recent transactions that our firm did. And can you ask and answer the following questions to yourself? I'm sure there's a number of business owners in the room, so the question first and foremost would be, what is my business worth? When do I want to stop working? Will the proceeds from a transfer fund my retirement or my next venture? Basically, does it make sense to turn things over to my children or to my employees? Not every business is turned over to its children. Maybe doesn't make sense to give it to the 2nd generation or 3rd generation. Who's going to run things if something unexpectedly happens to me? We see it all the time that someone has to get out of their business very quickly because of an illness or a death. And here's some triggers that do cause owners to leave their business. As I mentioned earlier, burnout, illness or death, cash flow problems, adverse market conditions. You kind of can run the gamut. I've kind of heard it all out there. So actually, have you planned for this particular day? I want to talk a little bit about 6 ways to leave your business, and these are the 6 ways that you can exit the business. You can sell it to an outside third party. You can liquidate, sell off all the assets. You can transfer it to a family member. You can sell it to a partner or partners. You can sell it to key employees, or you could go public. Here's the opportunity for business owners. 75% do not have a formal or informal exit plan. And 25% do not have an estate, tax, or financial plan. So for all those financial planners out there, there's some information out here that you can take away, I hope. 1 out of 2 businesses will sell in the next 10 years with all the baby boomers out there. You hear all the statistics out there. And then there's $10 trillion in estimated wealth transfer. And obviously the understanding and improving of the value drivers. The market, there's more than 500,000 small businesses in Illinois. And PricewaterhouseCoopers and Marquette University study said beginning in 2007, the next 15 years, 1 in 2 businesses will change ownership. So at the end of the day, what is the impact? You'll have 250,000 businesses on the market. So buyers will have an enormous amount of choices out there to choose from. And at the end of the day, is what Helen said, a business must stand out in order to get noticed. The current market conditions Businesses with stable or growing sales. Very few sectors were not impacted by the recession. I can say my business was affected by the recession. I was in the automotive marketplace. So obviously our business is no longer in business. But here's a couple sectors that were not impacted by the recession: healthcare, agriculture, repair, infrastructure. Strategic buyers are very active today. We have a tremendous amount of people in our database that are very actively looking for access to bank financing has improved. In 2010 and 2011, we did 3 deals that were bank financed. In 2012, we did over 30 deals that were bank financed. And then obviously the expiration of the Bush era law. What buyers typically want: immediate cash flow, recurring revenues, brand recognition, existing clients and vendor relationships. What buyers typically want: obviously, here's a list of them. They want immediate cash flow. They're looking for recurring revenues, brand recognition. They're looking for existing clients at the company. Vendor relationships are very important. Trained employees, infrastructure, financing, as well as training and transition. What drives value? There's a number of things that drive value. The facts, the hard things are the financials. The soft things are the value drivers. And we start with the top line. Flat is the new up. Infrastructure, you have to have a good infrastructure. Competition, obviously you have to have a landscape competition. Financials, business financials, they have to be managed very well. Industry, you have to have prospects. And the client base, you have to have a diversified client base. Not have a lot of concentration with one company. The universe of buyers, there's 4 that I've listed here. Employers, they don't have the capital to buy a business. Competitors, they understand the business. They know what you do. They typically will lowball the price on your business. High net worth, that's really the biggest group of people that we have by far today. They need the whole business. No way to take expenses out of the business. Private equity groups, obviously they have funds, the money available to purchase. And then we have strategic buyers. That increases the value. You can fold your business into their business, maybe merge facilities not in your industry sector directly. Determining value, that really gives you the performance of the business. And the slide before and this slide really tells you and gives you a full picture of what the business is worth. What we do is we work on 3 years history, and we, obviously by this you can see we do a cash flow EBITDA, plus add back all the owner's discretionary earnings, and then depending on the different business types, we add a cash flow multiple to that to come up with the valuation of the business. Here's a case study. The situation is this long-standing healthy business. The issue is the lack of an exit strategy and competition led to a deal fatigue. This is actually a pharmaceutical business. As you can see by this chart, this is how the deal looked like. So from start to finish, it took 8 months to close the deal. We had 350 targeted companies. 87 of those companies were qualified. And what I mean by qualified is we do the qualification internally based on their interest, based on their financial background. 64 of those went through what we call a CBP, or a comprehensive business review report. 17 of those had indications of interest. We got 5 offers, and actually at the end of the day, it was sold to 1 company. As you can see by the chart to the right, buyer 1, even though they were lowball, they were basically tossed out. So we worked with buyer 2, 3, 4, and 5. Buyer 3 actually ended up buying the business, and originally they came in at about an $8 million price level, but because it was a horse race, we had multiple companies buying for the spot. We were able to leverage buyer number 3 to increase the purchase up to a little over $9 million. Here's some recent transactions that we did. I guess the highlight here that I want to point out is that every one of these had bank financing, as you can see by the lower portion of the term sheet. But this just gives you a little bit of a background. When I say small to medium-sized marketplace, this is the type of field that we're playing in. Planning is the key. I know if you avoid pre-transition planning, your exit may not be very pretty. A transition planning is a process, not a single event. It takes time to build and sustain value, strengthen the management team, implement tax-saving strategies, and developing a gradual transfer process. And I came across this quote that I think is really appropriate to end my presentation. It's from John F. Kennedy. "The time to work on the roof is when the sun is shining." Thank you very much.
I'm theoretically on. As a person who is fond of folk music, I would point that Ellen has, in addition to her Kellogg MBA, a past on the board of the Old Town School of Folk Music. So if she decides to do an impromptu rendition of the Arkansas Traveler at the end of the Q&A session, be prepared. If she doesn't, also be prepared. Colleen Ryan is a member of the advisory committee to the Small Business Development Center at the College of DuPage, as is Ellen and as am I, and is extremely qualified to talk about both the U.S. Small Business Administration over many, many administrations and the banking business. You will note that she comes from a community bank. That's very important if you are looking for bank financing nowadays, because the larger banks, whatever they may say, are not necessarily in the business of doing deals in your size range. Community banks, however, are here, they're well-funded. Many of them have actually received some federal money to continue doing deals. And Colleen can tell you what you need to do to qualify for SBA loans.
Thank you. Well, when you hear of SBA, I'm sure you have an opinion. What is your opinion of SBA? Can they get done quickly? Do they approve any deals? Is there any money? No. And that's the history of 50 years of the SBA having a lot of money that they use for loans and very little for marketing. And the problem is people hear government financing and they mix up state of Illinois with federal government. You'll hear lots of advertising for state of Illinois programs, but I have never funded a loan ever with the state of Illinois. When's the last time you heard an advertising for an SBA loan? You haven't, because it all goes into funding. Last year, $20 billion with a B dollars in SBA loans in the fiscal year that ended in September of 2012. When you hear about loans not being done, I rarely blame the SBA. It's usually the bank. And at the last presentation I did last week, I asked people, what percentage do you think of SBA loans get done? And the answer came out 30%. The answer should be 100%, and it should be somewhere near 100%, because banks decide what gets sent to the SBA. And if a bank knows what it's doing, it's not going to waste your time or theirs putting a deal together and sending it in that's not going to get funded. We don't have time for that. There might be some negotiation, but never have I had a deal not get approved by the SBA. I just don't send in every deal that comes to my desk. It's got to fit a criteria, and you've got to follow the rules. It's a government agency. But when you hear about all the hoops you have to jump for a woman minority, it's a federal government program. There's two things that the federal government wants: job creation and retention, and profitable businesses who pay taxes. That's it. When you hear about these other kinds of programs, think state of Illinois. It's not the SBA. So disabuse yourself of the notion that the SBA doesn't do loans, because I've made a career out of it, and I'm a Canadian. If a Canadian can make a career out of doing SBA loans get done. And I'm here on a green card. I'm not even a citizen. And I've been here over 20 years, and I've been making SBA loans. But we're going to talk about just how the SBA loans relate to the buying and selling of businesses. And here are the eligibility rules. And they've upped those to help more money get on the street. So this is the maximum size for a business that you're buying. It has to have a tangible net worth of less than $15 million and an average net income after taxes of less than $5 million. That's a pretty big small business, and it's probably going to be able to finance just about anything that you're going to bring to the table. Here's what it won't do. Nothing speculative, no rental investment real estate, no partial purchase, and that's important. That's why I put it in red. You have to buy out 100% of the interest of the business that you're buying. If you are currently an owner of the business, say you have 25%, you can buy out the other partners, but it has to be all 75%, nothing partial. No nonprofits, no businesses engaged in financing, which means if it's an ancillary business, if you have a car business and you finance the paper, if more of the income from the business comes from financing the paper, then we can't do that deal because it's not really a car business, it's a financing business. And no religious organizations. Don't want to get into the whole church and state thing, so that rule, they read very tight. Loan maturities is what sells this program. And what you see here, typically on these kinds of deals, you don't have real estate involved. It's typically the business assets. A lot of times, the owner will hang on to the real estate, especially if it's a professional. If you have a dentist at the end of the career, owns the building, owns the business, he'll sell the business to an associate, hang on to the real estate and use that for income, and then sell maybe down the road. So typically, these deals don't include real estate. So we might do a blend. We might look at how much of it is equipment, but I can go up to 10 years on a strictly what we call working capital or no hard asset loan. Machinery and equipment up to 10 years. We've been able to push it to 15 for some very durable machinery, some stuff that I can get an appraisal to show the useful life, and real estate up to 25 years. Again, if it's going to be something that encompasses all of that, I'll do a blended term. Maximum interest rates. This isn't the interest rate. These are just the maximums. It's a negotiation. It's a negotiation with a bank. They're based off Wall Street Prime. I just did a deal, $1 million SBA deal at Prime. They can be fixed or floating. Again, it's a negotiation with the bank. The SBA doesn't set the rate. They say, here's the rules, banks. You can't charge more. And for most of these deals, they're going to be over $50,000. So the most I can charge is Prime plus 2 3/4 if the term is greater than 7 years. But there are deals that get done at Prime minus. We just can't go over Prime plus 2 3/4. And again, negotiate fixed or floating. There's only prepayment penalties if the maturity is greater than 15 years. So for the most part, what you're doing, if you're just buying a business for receivables or for the equipment or the goodwill, you're not going to have a term of greater than 15 years, so you're not going to be paying prepayment penalties. The SBA guarantees really don't affect you at all. A bank's not going to make a decision not to do a loan because it didn't get an 85% guarantee, it only got a 75% guarantee. But I put this up there so you can see what the fees are, because we hear that the SBA fees are expensive. The SBA fees are financeable, so we can make it part of the deal. And if you look at the last one, just to show you the math, or actually take the one in the middle, if the loan amount is between $150,000 and $1 and 700%, I get a guarantee of 75%. So I picked a loan of $500,000 because I could do that math easier. 500 times 75%, the guarantee fee is 3%, so the guarantee fee is just over $11,000. That's it. That's the one-time upfront fee that you pay to the bank, and we submit that to the SBA. We don't have any say in that. We can't charge a fee above that. Obviously, there'll be the obvious costs of a loan, searches and appraisals and the rest of it, but you would do that conventionally anyhow. This is the only ancillary fee that you would pay. So what can be financed? As I told you earlier, it's 100% of something. Either the business that you currently have partial ownership of or the purchase of something else. The one thing that has changed, and you hear all the time they change the rules, and I can tell you, I've been doing this for over 25 years. I took a 10-year hiatus, came back last April, and I could still do the manual because the rules didn't change very much. But when they tweak a rule, you got to know there's been a loss somewhere in the last 5 years. So what happened in the mid-2000s is that the SBA, there were a lot of businesses that got sold for a lot of reasons, and there was a lot of them that got financed through the SBA. And the SBA's losses on this part of the portfolio spiked. So they put in some rules to stop that in the future. So one of them is these consulting agreements that used to go on forever. So you'd have an owner that sold and be on a 60-month finance or a consulting agreement, and that would cause problems. It would cause expense for the business. So what they're saying now, these consulting agreements need to be over with in 12 months. If you can't learn what you need to learn from the seller in 12 months, maybe he's not ready to sell the business. The nice thing about the SBA is that we can finance intangible assets. Goodwill, lists, anything that's not tangible that you can't feel, and that's something that is very hard for banks to finance conventionally. You know, we like stuff, you know, we like collateral, we're like a pawn shop, we like to have the stuff that we can feel. So intangibles are hard to finance conventionally, but I can do it with the SBA. And the SBA won't turn down a loan solely for a lack of collateral. If that's the only risk factor, they can't turn the loan down, which, you know, a bank, we need to have the collateral. So that's, again, something nice. I send stuff to the SBA, which as a banker, I would say is about 40% collateralized, given the way that we calculate collateral, and still can get the deal done because there's really good cash flow, great character, great management experience, and so we can get things done this way that I couldn't do conventionally. Let's see. Other things that have changed in the last 5 years, if any of you have dealt in real estate, you know that we always have to have a real estate appraisal. Historically, the SBA didn't require business appraisals, and that caused some of the problems that we had in the mid-2000s. So now they're requiring appraisals. I can't use an appraisal that you had done. It's just like real estate now. I can't use an appraisal that the seller had prepared, that the broker had prepared. The bank has to order the appraiser. And it has to be someone who's accredited, and there's a whole bunch of alphabet soup of different associations that can do accredited appraisals, but we need to order that appraisal. So, you know, if you know you're going into a business and you're going to need financing, hold off on getting that appraisal because you may be paying for it twice. It is required when the amount being financed is greater than $250,000. Now that nets out the value of the durable assets, if there's any real estate, if there's any equipment. So just know going in, anything net of that over 250, I'm going to have to get an appraisal. And another thing that they've added is if there's a close relationship, father selling to son, mother selling to daughter, cousins, is always going to need an appraisal. And particularly if there's a lot of goodwill involved, we have to come up with some kind of valuation of that goodwill. That's all I'm going to say right now because the SBA manual is over 400 pages, and I'm sure you don't want to hear about it. But if you do run into some deals and you just get my business card at the end and you want to run something off me, if you're attorney, broker, or whatever in the room that just wants to say, does this sound right? This is what the bank's saying to me. I'm happy to provide some free consulting advice on that if you need it. Thanks.
I do recommend rather strongly, as part of your preparatory process for selling your business, and as your part of your process before you start going and searching for a business, that you do talk to a banker. I mean, there are fairly conventional team portions. Bill Wentz back there, I think, has done more deals than anybody else in the room. Have you ever seen a business that didn't have to have a good bank, a good accountant, and a good lawyer? Finding a good one may always be a problem, but the point of the exercise is business is a team sport. It's a team sport in acquisitions. It's a team sport in sales. This is a lot more like March Madness than we like to talk about. And as a Duke graduate, I will say we do not like Maryland nowadays, and we're not happy. But maybe next month we'll beat them again because we did last time. Moving on, and not doing sports references, our final speaker has done more than 19 deals in many, many different capacities and has seen them come, has seen them go, and will be telling us a little bit more about what works in the negotiation and sale process from the business owner's perspective.
Thanks, Bill. Looks like this works okay. So just curious, no questions yet tonight. On the show of hands, buyers, people interested in buying? All right. and sellers? So about the same, right? So more on the buyer side than on the seller side. I've been on both. What do I do? Do a page down there?
Just arrow up, arrow
Okay. I've been on both sides, starting and selling a business. My first real career job was with GE Healthcare, and got to be involved in 9 different acquisitions and 2 different divestitures there. And then started and sold my own, and then worked in a couple of different consulting firms, integrating and working on due diligence for different deals. And was in corporate development for a few years. Most of my experience has been on, say, the healthcare or the life sciences side. So when I think about the typical life cycle of the deal, you go through some very strong changes, either buying or selling. And the next 2 topics that I have, basically the negotiation and the closing, start to come into play right here towards the end of the life cycle. So you've already gone through a targeting exercise or a strategy exercise to decide that you want to buy or sell, that you're in the market for inorganic growth, if you will, right, versus organic growth. And you've made a decision that an acquisition or a merger or some type of an alliance is some type of inorganic growth is the right way to go. You'll get a lot of different difficult questions. You'll get a lot of different opinions around if that's the right way to go or not, because M&A is dealt with risk, right? Some of the biggest monetary decisions that you'll ever make. As you start working your way over to targeting buyers and targeting screening potential candidates, and what Pat showed was a way to get buyers for a specific business, right? Following a very structured process to end up with an auction. Because as a seller, you want the highest price, right? As a buyer, you want to pay the lowest price, right? So you sit down across that table, and all these processes are meant to get us to a point of negotiating a deal. You get to a small list of targets, whether you're a buyer or a seller, that is. And you want to get to the table to be able to start negotiating that deal, right? And you talk to a number of people before you even get to actually negotiating. You know, you're talking to them about, would they sell? What are they interested in selling for? Why would they? You know, you're approaching people that don't have their business for sale necessarily. And a lot of what happens in a negotiation or closing has a lot to do with whether you were approached or you were approaching others. You know, how into the sale were you? How well advised were you back in those early stages? And how set are you on your M&A strategy? So the two topics that I honed in on, negotiating and closing, all right? For the negotiations overall, price is the first topic to tackle. It's the topic that if you can't resolve in my experience, 3 weeks, leave. You may or may not come back. You know, kind of like buying a stock and already knowing the price that you want to sell it at, or the price you want to sell it at if you're losing money, or the price you want to sell it at if you're making money. But if you can't get through a price discussion with a business owner, the business owner hasn't gone through that other process of wanting to sell. If you can't get to a price with a business owner because of projections, which is really the second point there, and I saw in a couple of presentations earlier that, you know, make sure you know your business, make sure you know your market, which clearly all business owners do, and then put some projections together, all right? And having sat on both sides of this desk, I tend to smile a bit when I think about projections, because I love it when a business owner hands me projections. I love wildly optimistic projections, because that has a wildly optimistic price that goes with it. And it ain't going to happen. It's certainly not going to happen up front, because we're not going to believe it when we're buying, right? Which starts to go to structuring. Okay, you know, one of the first slides we had is prices and everything. I worked with a brilliant corporate development VP, And he sat across the table, and we had one of these types of situations, and they couldn't get off a price. And I really didn't think that we were going to be talking about this much more until he said, I'll tell you what, you name a price, I'll pay anything you want. I name all the terms and conditions. We were able to leave the room, come back in, and start talking a little bit more rationally about what kind of price and what kind of deal structure. And by deal structure, I mean how much cash up front, how much cash after a few milestones, how much cash after some performance and some history is in there, or an earn-out, or other structures that diversify the risk, keep some on the business owner that's selling, and keep some on the buyer and having to pay that full price if those actual performance milestones are met. But a simple term or condition like, I'll give you 100% of your sales price 5 years from now, changes the tone of the price conversation and might get you to a point where you can actually have a conversation around what kind of cash flows, what kind of reasonable projections. Because you made a $50 million, a $5 million, a $500,000 investment in your business last year in capital equipment, and you expanded your capacity by 50%, it does not mean you're going to sell at that capacity. It might. But if your sales have been flat for the past 2 years, right, which quite a few companies have, why would that capacity sell out? Why, as a buyer, am I to believe that all of a sudden the market's going to show up and buy up the capacity that you decided to put $500,000 into, right? Those are the discussions that happen across the table for selling the business and for me trying to believe on the buying side that that capacity is going to be filled up. That was a good investment. You should get some benefit from that 10 years out in the future, or 7 years out in the future, or 5 years out in the future. That's part of my valuation model. Right? Now on the selling side, when I've been sitting on the selling side, you want to be more optimistic and you want to get some part of that investment that you just made. And you might be willing to say, I'll stay with the business for 3 years. I'll manage the sales department, I'll manage the marketing department, I'll manage production, or whatever it was, the certain specialties are that will help us to ensure that we'll hit those milestones and I'll get my money and you'll get your value. And that's where the last part of the bottom here goes into employees and employee commitments. One of the very first topics that usually comes up, depending on the size of the business, certainly in the $30 to $100 million business transactions that I've been involved in, one of the first topics at the table is, what are you going to do about the employees? What about I have 2 manufacturing plants. I got a distribution center over here in another state. What are you going to do about the employees? And at that point in the stage, you can't commit to anything. And it doesn't make the guy or gal sitting across the table from you happy at all. But you can't get to the employee discussion until you've gone through the financial and diligence discussion. So you need to get a very good professional team that's advising you through this process to help you to get some legal language into these agreements, into your letter of intent, that pretty clearly lays out what your intentions are without committing you to having to keep a certain manufacturing plant or a certain distribution center or a certain asset open for 3 to 5 years. Frankly, at that stage of the game, you'd be nuts to sign something like that, right? You need to get a lot more information on the table before you can get to the point from a buying perspective of committing to not shutting something down. When I bought a manufacturer, roughly $50 million out of North Carolina, catheter manufacturer, we knew at year 3 we were going to be manufacturing those catheters in India. I was part of a strategic buyer, and the employees were very important as they are to every owner of a business. And he wanted to know just how much time he had, really. So we were able to have that discussion about, well, by the end of year 1, we'll have our manufacturing capacity at about 25 to 50% of what we're going to need. By the end of year 3, we want to be at 100%. So let's make sure we give everybody enough notice. And it was very upfront. It was pretty much a joint discussion. And he was using a lot of the funding that he was getting to start other businesses he kept the real estate, so he still had the building. he had the manufacturing equipment, and basically it was a partnership about how we were going to exit with him, so that we tried to work the best deal we could for him and the employees, and for us in our cost position. And we also had a Asian kind of sales strategy that went with it, so it was the right product at the right time for that. So that was one way, at least, in which an employee discussion was handled that I thought was one of the better ones for us that I've been involved in anyway. The other point I wanted to make around negotiations, and this has been the fun one actually, is different size acquisitions have very different expectations and types of investors. I've had individuals sitting across from me ready to write a $10 million check that never did a net present value calculation, never had any kind of really financial education with them, but just said, I want to know how much, when I put this in, how much am I going to get back and when am I going to get back? You know, very, very fundamental type of, you know, dollars, right? And you've got other types of financial deals, and certainly when you're dealing with the financial side of the business, bankers, how you're financing the loan, then you got to have your finance beyond compare. So the professional team that you need and have is important regardless of who the buyer is. Certainly the clauses, the outs you have when you're getting to the negotiation, when you're getting to the closing table, at some point lawsuits get filed and you want to be able to just walk. Just leave. The buyer doesn't want you to be able to leave. So how well that clause, and this is when everyone runs back and starts reading far more carefully the contract that they signed than they read it, even though they read it very carefully earlier. But now they're in a specific situation where they need to get out. They don't want any part of this firm that just got sued for something, yet their clause wasn't written that lets them out. So the professional advice you get winds up being incredibly important when the situation changes. I was involved in one of those as well, where buyers just completely went away as soon as a lawsuit was filed. And you wind up from a bidding situation where they're all bidding on an asset to they're all leaving from an asset, and you're back to looking for them. The closing. I've found that relationships, and I really wanted to start at the closing with this one, is that, I mean, the closings themselves are pretty boring events, at least they should be. You show up, sign a bunch of papers, nobody really is doing anything, there's conference rooms, and you know, you're walking around, signing a bunch of things, and it's, you know, a complete non-event after a whole lot of emotions and a whole lot of very late nights doing due diligence. The relationships start to come into play after closing when you need to make a phone call to somebody 2 years later, and there were a few slides around intangible assets or processes that weren't documented, or even employee relationships, and you've got a really key employee, and now all of a sudden he hates one of the new owners, and you got to keep him, and you need the guy that you bought the business from to come back and talk to him and talk some sense into him. If you were a jerk to that guy, he's not coming back and talking to him, and actually he's probably the guy trying to take the guy away from you, right? I've had a number of situations where 2 and 3 years later, when employees have non-compete agreements and they can't come back to work for the person that sold the business and things like that, where you've developed relationships with the people that you did the deal with, and 2 years later you're on the phone with them talking about some of these employees that have done some of these things they weren't supposed to do. Legally enforceable, we may or may not want to enforce them, right? What usually determines whether you want to enforce that or not? How good of a relationship you had with them, and how much damage one employee can do. You don't want to set precedent, but a lot of times you can talk about talk through those conversations, and an employee goes back to that organization. It's fine, you know. The questions usually are, how many other people know that that employee is leaving us and going back to that company? Right? If you have the relationship, you can have that conversation. If you didn't get that relationship built when you were doing the transaction, you can't. That's very much from a strategic buyer standpoint. I touched on the lawsuits. The contracts and intellectual property, of course, I've done a lot of deals in the healthcare and life science space, so I mean intellectual property is a very big component of that typically. The representations that we get in the intellectual property, when there's physicians that have a piece of IP that they've granted the rights to a small manufacturer to be able to make, and now we bought them, we need those rights to be assignable to us. If those rights aren't assignable, and if that physician that has, or inventor that has assigned the rights to that small company doesn't want to sign those over to you, you're held hostage. Now you've got a situation where, and I've faced it a number of times, where they want to come back to the table and negotiate a new deal. Right? The terms were fine when it was a small company. Now you're a bigger company. You've got more money. You should be paying me more. All of a sudden, my intellectual property is worth more. Right? So it's being ready. It's a cottage industry. It takes a lot of people with group purchasing organization agreements. The number of contracts typically in any one company all of a sudden gets really big when you stop to sit and look at them. And then you look at which contracts are really important to me being able to run my business, and then which ones are transferable, which ones are assignable, which ones can I just assign based on the company signing it, and which ones have to have permission of the company that assigned it to assign it. Those are huge questions that sometimes show up late in the deal and can kill a closing because you're not getting a key contract, a supplier, a customer, or a technology signed and assigned to your new company before you close. And you need it to be able to run the business. So contracts is a real watch point. Some of the key terms at the bottom there, the things that I've run into, purchase price adjustments, alternative dispute resolutions. No one wants to go to court. They want to handle it with mediation. But the purchase price adjustments is up front, you'll find yourself negotiating a 2%, 1%, 5% of the transaction fund. Sits in escrow, sits in an account for 90 days after the close. And as you really then close the books and value up all the assets and the audit goes through, you were doing a sample count of assets, not a full physical count of assets before the deal. And this fund sits there, and then you start to get into purchase price adjustments, which is the value of those assets after the close. How much gets in that count in the first place? And then who approves what deducts from the purchase price and who gets that money, the buyer or the seller, after close, is a really big topic, and a clause that you certainly want to watch in the agreement if you're on the buying or selling side. And indemnification. This is another one that I try to tackle right up front, right? How much are you going to indemnify, hold harmless, the people that are buying your business afterwards? Basically, you haven't misrepresented anything, they haven't misrepresented anything. That can be a really, really big number. What you try to do is keep it far less than the value of the transaction. So if you're a typical small business owner in the kind of 25 to, I think last year, 75% of deals, no, 80% of deals were less than 75 million. So if you're part of that 80%, you don't want an indemnity clause that has you liable for 500 million or unlimited or 100 million or anywhere near the purchase price. So watch the indemnity clause, and that's another place where, I speak to a few of these, but from the implementation and the business side far more than from the lawyer side, right? But you get good counsel. Those are the ones that I've found to be really most important, and I try to really just hone in on the process overall, the negotiation itself, some of the not so wild but real things that I've seen across the table on both sides, and then what gets you to close, and then through close, and the people that you wind up living with after the closing. Don't burn relationships in the process, because that can come back to haunt you. Right? Were you opening up for questions or thoughts?
That's our next step. Do we have any questions for members of the panel? And what I'd suggest you do is come on up here and talk into the mic so you can be on the video too. And stand on the right-hand side of the podium, or you can be silent on the video too.
Well, I have a simple question for Bill. Can we get a hold of the PowerPoint Can I put it on our website?
You can get hold of her PowerPoint and his PowerPoint and Ellen's PowerPoint, but not Pat's, because it is proprietary.
Good.
And the answer is, for those three, yes, for her, no, but you can watch this on Vimeo, so you can see her PowerPoint on the Vimeo, and our site can link it to the Vimeo.
How many people have watched the videos of past performances here? Oh, there's two of us. By the way, I just put up 25 of them up on our website, organized them, by month, by topic, who talked, what they talked about. So if you want to go back and watch them, they're all well organized, so you can watch them. But I did get the suspicion that not a lot of people want to spend an hour watching one of the recaps. So the PowerPoint sometimes are quicker, okay?
Well, we got three.
Thank you.
Other questions? Come on, stand up and face the camera. It's unfortunate or fortunate, but we want to make this available to people who do look up on the site.
I'm just hoping you guys are going to think no question is a stupid question. Okay. Question to you, John. Is it this, when you were saying about the indemnification, is it depends on if it is a stock purchase or assets purchase or anything like that?
Not in my experience. Probably better answered by a lawyer for, how that would end up being. But in my experience, both in stock or asset agreements, there's an indemnification clause.
Asset purchase can reduce the amount of liability that may be asserted by third parties. Indemnification is what you agree with the other party to the sale, and so your agreement determines your liability. Joe?
Hi, John. Question regarding the indemnification as a percent of purchase price. In your experience in, say, a $5 to $10 million transaction on a privately held target, what would you say is a typical and market type percent?
For that type of,
For that size, roughly 3 to 5% of the purchase price for the fund.
not for the fund,
Right?
for indemnification.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm thinking purchase price allocation, actually, when you said that. Oh, boy. Maybe half the purchase price. Those would be intellectual property heavy deals where some of the assignments were complete and they're pretty important to the technology or the platform of the product portfolio going forward.
And if there are no known issues.
I haven't had many. I've had more on the intellectual property issue side where the indemnification clauses were pretty high.
One of the nice things is that Aon Corporation and some other major insurers actually sell indemnification insurance. They also sell terms and conditions insurance. So you can get them to stand behind things. And once you get north of 10 or 20 million, there's actually enough money in the deal to afford these kinds of things. Other questions?
My question is, in regards to when you're the buyer and you see a potential opportunity where the EBITDA is flat and cash flow is flat, and you see bringing them onto your platform, the economic value add in that, what metric would you recommend you hone in on to come up with a valuation of that company?
Pat, you want to take this?
I absolutely could take that. Obviously, our business is not based on evaluation, based on projections. So we don't look at projections as a piece of the value of the business. So the way we will take a look at that is we'll have the EBITDA, we also break it down and look at the owners as far as what part of the business the owners use as their personal use. So we add back a whole bunch of add backs per se. It could be anything like health insurance. It could be automobile. I actually had a client that his travel expenses were roughly $100,000 for 2 people. I said, what in the world is that? At the end of the day, they took several weeks of family vacation, which a new owner would never see. So we would add all that stuff back in, and then that we would come up with the value of that business. And then what we do depending on the type of business it is, we will then add a multiple to that. So for retail, pardon? I've never had a 0 number. If I have a negative number, typically, the business is, I'll look at that. Depending on the type of business that it is, we most likely will recommend them to liquidate the business and sell off the assets. But let me just further say that if there's also a business that has been around for many years and has a lot of history, there could be some value there. We just have to dig further and take a look at it more deeply.
I just want to say, as a banker looking at that, it depends. If you're a retail operation and you don't have a wholesale presence and you're buying someone that's a wholesale presence that you want to add to your business, what would be the cost of you getting that off the ground? So maybe there is value to take a going concern that maybe shows 0 cash flow, but the opportunity cost for that would be better than you having to launch that from the ground up. If you can make that case and it makes sense, and you can show that you're a going concern that can absorb that, and that you can take that over a 2-year projection and make money, I'll listen to that. We've sent deals in that look like that, especially someone who's in the business who knows what they're doing. Now, what would be harder is if someone coming in decides that they're going to use their golden parachute to buy this business that shows that it has no cash flow. The SBA treats that like a startup. Even though it's a going concern, the guy buying it is a startup that's buying something else out there that shows no cash flow. That's a different situation than someone already making money in that business.
Tim?
I have a SBA financing question. Can SBA financing be used for engineering-type companies, professional services? There's no type of business exclusion.
I gave you the list.
Gotcha.
You're not allowed to use it to buy congressmen. That's more traditionally done with private money. And that would be a political action committee discussion, not a business buying discussion anyway. Other questions from the audience? All right, then I'm going to do a simple hypothetical. After hearing all of this, have any of you decided to become sellers that were not sellers before? Any want to become buyers that weren't buyers before? All right. Final question. To the sellers and the buyers in the room, not to all the sharks. The rest of us are well known to each other. Did this panel address the questions you had about buying or selling, or is there anything else that we could provide you in the way of information that would help you make your decisions? Any comments, any other information you need? Go ahead. The question to the panel, and also since this is an audience-wide issue, to anybody in the audience, comments on sourcing businesses, finding businesses that are appropriate targets for you to buy. I'll give you one comment. There are about 2,000 companies between 5 and 50 million in sales in DuPage County and Kane County. If 1 out of 2 of them are going to sell, there are 1,000 businesses that will be for sale within the next 10 years. Look around your neighborhood, because you can almost always find more information about local companies than you can about a company on the other side of the world. That doesn't mean there aren't international opportunities. There are. But just think about where there are. So, next comment from the audience on sourcing.
One thing you can look at is some of the industry associations out there, they're like the Midwest Business Brokers and Intermediaries, they put on buyer orientations. There's actually one tomorrow in Oak Brook at 8:30 in the morning, but we hold those every other month in Oak Brook and downtown. And that's a great place to, begin that search. Look into ACG, the Association for Corporate Growth, for larger size deals. There's different sorts of industry associations where you can get around deal makers who will hear about more businesses out there, and just network like crazy. Let people know I'm interested, and word of mouth is a great way too.
I'd also suggest you talk to the publisher of the trade journal for whatever industry you specialize in, because they probably know very well who the people are in the industry, at least on the supplier side, since those are their advertisers.
I guess I'd turn it back a bit to say, what industry do you have experience in, or your management team have experience in? Based on the question of, do you need financing, and how much do you want to pay for it? Or do you want to be credible when you go to get it? So I would start targeting it first by looking in the mirror and saying, me, my management team, the people I'm with, what do we credibly have experience in running, right? Just like this example of somebody who had a boatload of money, bought a new business, a bank would treat him like a startup because he's got no experience running that business in that market with those customers and those suppliers and anything specific to that little market segment. Start there. Or you'll pay more for financing, you won't be viewed as credible by equity investors, and you'll have a long road ahead of you.
Other things we could give you information on. Anything else you might need in order to buy or to sell? Michael?
Another source for deals, for businesses that are for sale, would be franchisors. All of the franchisors know their franchisees and who wants to sell. Right now, I'm doing quite a few deals where the buyer is buying multiple existing franchise operations, and they could have easily been found just by calling the franchisor in the first place.
Buyers or sellers? Anything else we could provide you?
Need some help here. Ellen said that invest money to upgrade your facility, look your best. So that means investment, right? Then John said, don't invest on equipment, thinking you're going to increase your volume. So that's more investment. So how do you decide what the sweet spot is?
I'm going to give that to Ellen.
I think that investment decision is like most other investment decisions. It's going to be return on your investment. It's going to be return on what you've put in there. You don't invest if you can't get it back. You don't invest if you can't get it back plus. So it's an art, not a science. When you have a house, they say don't build a swimming pool, don't build a moat, but you might want to change the kitchen cabinets. It's the same kind of a thing. You need to think about what the return is going to be on the investment you've made.
I think that's a great example. I mean, it comes down to belief, and the person sitting across the table from you really believing what you believed when you made that investment. And if you can get them to believe that same business case that you invested in, then it should be a good investment. They should at least be willing to talk to you about sharing some of that valuation with you.
And since SBA earnouts are essentially impossible beyond 1 year, it would be nice if that business has more than 10 million, so a conventional loan looks good. Sir.
I have two questions. The first is that in regards to the earnout, obviously that's a good way for the buyers the earnout decreases the risk for the buyers and increases the risk for the sellers. How many deals do you guys see in which an earnout is not done? And can I ask this a follow-up question?
Okay. The question is percentage deals in which you don't see an earnout. Give a number and I'll just repeat the number. John? It's almost impossible to give a seller the money they want unless you have one. Colleen, any? Right. Ellen? In other words, as a seller, expect that you're not going to get everything you ask for unless you can structure a good earnout. Follow up.
And my follow-up question was that in regards to the business brokers, how are those fees assessed? Are they done as a percentage of the transaction, or are they flat fee upfront?
Just a moment, we'll have you say this on mic. In that case, it'll be recorded, but this is a fairly conventional answer.
In our business, there's no fees up front. Our fees are all based on success, based on making the deal happen. We have a minimum fee. Our minimum fee is $18,000, and then once you get into the bigger deals, then it's a percentage of that.
Anything else you need to know in order to be able to buy or sell confidently? Yes, sir.
Thank you. We've seen an increasing role of government and government regulation over the last 4 or 5 years. How has that impacted projections that you've worked through over those last 4 or 5 years, and how do you see it working going forward? In particular, from the cost side, obviously.
I'll hand this to John first, since of course healthcare has no regulations whatsoever.
Really more on the diligence side that I've seen it. More around who knew about, and I'm thinking the large public deals now, who knew about it. And all the SEC looking back at, anybody, and boy, the emails that you get and the lists of names. So I've seen it very heavily on the diligence side. On the integration side, in healthcare, it's always been there pretty extensively.
I'll give you one other source of information if you want to look at whether there may be new regulations that will affect your industry. There is an Office of Regulatory Affairs within the U.S. Department of the Office of Management and Budget. They look at every single regulation that might have more than 100 million in economic impact. There are approximately 137 of those currently in the pipeline. So if your industry may have that type of effect, if, for instance, you were trying to buy or sell a coal-fired power plant, as of last year, we suddenly have mercury as a new criteria pollutant that must be controlled. That made a significant difference in the economics of that particular type of power facility. So looking industry by industry, and looking specifically not for past violations, but for future regulatory impact, you may be able to put that into your valuation mix. Other comments from the panel on regulation? Yes, sir.
Prior to this recession, EBITDA multiples were, by some estimates, extraordinary in terms of buy-sell relationships. Those changed during this recession. I'd be interested in what you're seeing in terms of trends, in terms of sell prices relative to EBITDA multiples, number one. And number two, are there any instances in your experience where that is not a good barometer or a good way to assess the value of a company?
I'll give you 3 brief comments, and then I'm going to turn this over to the panel. Who you're selling to is likely to determine what your real possible multiple might be. So if you're selling to a strategic, you might get your highest If you're selling to a private equity firm, there are at least some general statistics, 6 to 8, pick a number. If you're selling to a private party, on the other hand, the firm might be worth a lot less. And this is precisely where you need a good broker. So I'll turn this over to Pat.
I commented a little bit about what Bill said during my presentation, but he's absolutely correct. You know, the competitors, selling your business to a competitor, they know your business. They're going to definitely give you the lowest price for your business. So you want to go beyond that. Think of a Target, you know, and you're in the middle, you're the seller. What you want to do is you want to take yourself all the way out to the outside of that. So your employees, your competitors are all really close to you, but your private equity groups, your strategic buyers, your key strategic buyers are all outside of that world of those other folks, and that would be the best place to get the highest value for your business. As of your first question about the EBITDA and the trends, I come from a manufacturing background, so you can understand how 7, 8, 9, how that whole industry was completely shattered, particularly in the automotive industry. And a lot of my former competitors are no longer in business. The ones that were able to survive, they absolutely cut it as thin as they could cut it. What I'm seeing today is a lot of those businesses are thriving, they're coming back, they're healthy, they're as busy can be. I actually have a former competitor of mine that I just recently spoke to, and 2 years ago, he was around a $15 million business. He's now projected for this year to be about $25 million in business. So most of those folks, too, are also in the baby boomer age group, too. So as you kind of look at that whole big picture, I see the trends definitely increasing from a business standpoint, from a selling standpoint.
Okay, let's see, how many more questions do we have time for? It's only 8:22, actually. It just feels somewhat later, so we do have time. I'm going to go to this gentleman because you've already asked one, and then we'll go to you next. My apologies, as I walk around, I tend to fall over things.
Thank you. This question is more for Pat. I guess, like, regarding to business valuations, how do you find the valuation for the similar business transactions? Do you need to ask multiple brokers, or is there any potential, like, online source similar to, like, real estate? You can see the house price, recent sales, but is there any similar information for business sales transactions? Thank you.
And I'm going to be nasty and ask at least 2 brokers, so we'll start with Pat, and then we'll move on to Joe McCall. No, wait a minute, we've got another broker right over here who specializes in representing buyers, so we'll go to 3 brokers and get 3 different answers. Pat, yours first.
Well, obviously, as I mentioned, our company does do complimentary valuations for business owners. That's one of the unique features that we offer. And how we handle that is, again, we do the EBITDA, plus we add everything back, and then we come up with the cash flow number and add a multiple to that. So that's very basic. So that's how we do it.
Next, Joe.
Well, your question is where to find out the valuation information. The primary external source that I use for market data is Pratt Stats. It's a subscription database, and you'll frequently see, if you read Inc. magazine, they're quoting valuation multiples of this, that, or the other. Well, that's where they're usually getting it from if you look at the footnotes.
Moving on to a 3rd broker. Are there any other business brokers in the house? Nope, as I thought. We've got 3 professional business brokers. You got 3 good answers.
Pratt Stats is good. You can go there. Our business is actually not focused on anything that normative, because we're specifically trying to locate businesses that are not for sale, and therefore we're not particularly concerned about the norms in the marketplace. Also, to respond to your question, multiples are actually back to about where they were in 2007. So they have come back. Pricing is still lower because profit margins are not as rich as they were. the multiples are back, and that's a function of competition in the marketplace.
One subsidiary comment on the legal side. The other place these multiples tend to come in is on the buy-sell agreements between various partners. And a lot of them are set at very, very high multiples, partly because people have high expectations for their firms, but also in part because many of the multiples were set back in the 2005-2010 period, and they're wrong. This is the virtue of going to state bar meetings. We have a young lady here is our next first questioner, and then I'll get to you, sir.
Does the multiple changes according to the industry, like engineering versus medical, healthcare? Where is the with the recent healthcare changes happening and with Obamacare and everything? Are healthcare, where does this multiple stands right now?
I think multiples are an after the fact. I think they're what you look at after you look at discounted cash flows and you have a plan that goes out and you look at the net present value and you go back and then you look at the financials and see where that lands you in a multiple range rather than a multiple itself. You know, I think it's an after the fact. I think it's where am I relative to my competitors or recent deals? Am I high or low when I look at a discounted cash flow based model for valuing my business? So I'm biased that way. Healthcare deals, it depends where you sit. If you're a physician group, you're desperate to get affiliated with a hospital. So they're buying them up like crazy, right? If you are a life science company, you're pretty flush with cash and you're paying really high multiples for biotech type companies that are biosimilar type drugs, right? So it depends where you're sitting. Health plans are consolidating like crazy and the multiples are going up, even for government business, even for Medicare, Medicaid type business, because they're in such demand and it's consolidating. So most of the areas of healthcare are going up relative to historical positions.
Two other comments on multiples. If you are a very small business, say 0 to 500,000, you're lucky to get the asset values and those will be heavily discounted. If you are a 500,000 to say a $3 million business, you're lucky to get a 3. Pick a number, but it's certainly going to be smaller than something for which professional investment groups are likely to bid. And when you get to a private equity range, say 10 million gross, 2 to 3 million EBITDA, you again get a higher multiple range than you could get as a smaller company. And of course, if you have a public exit and you are Apple, you may be trading at 48 even after your shares go way, way down. So you can become a billionaire very quickly. That's not the market most of us operate in. But certainly public company multiples are better than private because you don't have what is called in the valuation terms a marketability discount. Sir.
I hear a lot of discussion on things based on EBITDA, but I have to believe, a question I have is how much weight do you put on that versus top line? Because number of companies walk in, you can recognize the poor management and you can decide that you can cut down the cost. EBITDA could be highly misleading as you look at things. Any experience on based on top line versus EBITDA?
I'll give this to our banker because she usually has to look at these things.
I don't know what good big sales are if you don't make any money. Because at the end of it all, you got to make some money. And sales don't pay back loans. Earnings do. Right. And so it all depends on who the buyer is. Again, what's your experience? What have you done? What are you going to do differently? Why aren't those sales converting to the bottom line? And if you can explain that to me, if maybe there's a process that you've got differently, if it's a manufacturing kind of company and it's a modernization issue, you got to tell the story. And when you think about it, You're like an attorney trying your case when you come to a bank, because it's not our job to tell you what the number should be. It's my job to figure out if what you're telling me makes any sense. And then if I'm going to the SBA, now I'm the attorney trying my case at the SBA, and whatever you tell me is what I've got to be able to analyze, make sense out of, and sell it upstream. So
I think another issue that you face in that situation is you have to reverse a trend. And the reason that that company is going under is that it's on a downward trend. And besides all of the things that Colleen mentioned, I think one of the things you've got to look at is how are you going to turn that thing around? There's people involved, there's vendors involved, there's going to be some debt involved. To turn that thing around is going to be more probably than just coming in as a more astute manager. So I think one of the things that you need to think about is what is it going to take to turn that company around?
I'll turn that over to Pat then.
One of the other things that we look at is the value drivers, as I mentioned. You know, there's certain things, is the business the owner? Can the owner go away on vacation for a couple weeks, and can the business run on its own, or does he have to be there all the time? You know, like again, you have the concentration of your suppliers, of your customers. You know, if you have 90% with one company, we were in a deal and the business was going through due diligence, and during the due diligence period, that seller lost his 90% customer. Guess what happened to the deal? It never went through. So it's really key to kind of look at all those value drivers when you go through the process.
Pat mentioned a word which is dear to every lawyer's heart, and that is due diligence. I will give you a very simple example of why you need to do this, or better yet, why you need to walk away. Had a client who was dealing, he had worked on the Chicago Board of Trade, so he knew everything, and wanted to buy a, quote, cash-flowing business. So he picked up proposal to purchase a car wash from 3 Jordanian brothers, and they carefully explained that each of them had a set of books, one for the tax authorities, one for the family, and the other one, as they carefully assured him, was the real set of books. I gave him the IRS manual for auditing car washes, which depends on volume of water and volume of soap purchased, and suggested that he run the cash register for 3 weeks and see what actually came through the door, or possibly just that he walk away. I don't know what he did. He fired me because I was not a positive influence on his deal. I think I'm very happy about that at this point. Other questions or horror stories or comments? We've got one. Mike, you've already asked one. We have 2 gentlemen who have not yet. So they go first, then later. These 2 gentlemen, then you, sir, and then I'll go back to Mike. We're still not up to 9 p.m., so we're still within our time frame.
Thank you. Probably for Pat or, names. John. What's the minimum threshold on the point of due diligence you just mentioned, car wash, 3 weeks at the cash register? What's the minimum threshold quality of information you should expect to buy a small business?
You get a different answer from the lawyer, from the banker, and for the business person, but we'll hand this to Pat since you asked her the question.
Well, the way our process works is typically when we recast the numbers, that's all the potential buyers see until they are in due diligence. And when we get into the due diligence phase, that's when the tax returns and all the books are basically open. And that's the reason why the value of having multiple entities in the as far as lined up is so important, because number one can definitely drop out when they get in the due diligence phase for one reason or another.
We still have 2 more first-time questioners, and then we'll go to Michael Liss. Sir.
Hello, I think I might like to be a buyer, and I'm geographically flexible. So my question is, I like the idea of investing in the community, but I'm pretty hesitant to invest in Illinois. So my question is, are there any geographically based reasons to look in other markets, either because of the lending environment, the abundance of sellers relative to buyers, or is there any other consideration to think about different geography outside of Illinois? Or do you still believe that Illinois could be a good environment?
Let's see, I'll give this to the Canadian. And I'll strongly recommend the province of Prince Edward Island, where my mother lives.
Well, monsieur, je préfère Canada. No, I'll tell you something interesting. I just went to, before Christmas, an accounting firm that did, and Dr. Robert Janetsky, an economist that some of you may have heard speak before, he did this presentation on something that came out of the Fraser Institute, which is Canadian, out of British Columbia. And they did this survey, so it was they looked at North American provinces and states, and they listed the ones that had the best potential for growth in the future. And they looked at a whole bunch of variables that were different than what you'd normally look at. And it was really fascinating when you look. And Illinois was near the bottom of the pile. And it was for things like corruption, and it was for things like regulatory burden and just quality of life. And the hot states that were interesting, so I'm planning my retirement because Canada's too bloody cold, but what I was looking at, they said Washington State, Texas were two of the top 5, and there was a Canadian province, I think it was British Columbia, but if you go to, it's at the Fraser Institute, Fraser, and it's Simon Fraser University, and it's, or Janetsky, I think he's got a website too, if you check that. And it's a very fascinating study as they look at economic opportunity in the future.
Bob, by the by, is a Chicagoan. He hates everywhere else in the country. And so he may write this, but he always comes back here. You can be an owner in Illinois and have your tax location in a tax-free state, except that your personal income will then still be subject to high personal income taxes. And that is one of the other things your lawyers and your accountants should be talking to you about before you structure your business. There are states that don't have income taxes. There are states that don't have sales taxes. Unfortunately, there is no state with neither income nor sales taxes. And there are countries that still operate on a very efficient basis. If you ever want to make a tax administrator from a state mad, or better yet, a country one, start talking about what's called a double Dutch sandwich, which means operating out of Ireland, but having your headquarters in the Netherlands. So there's no actual withholding on your income, and so your Irish 12.5% tax rate subsidiary proceeds to be the situs of all of your income within the European Union. It's a convenient thing. Moving forward, we have one more first-time questioner.
You know, there's a lot of talk about due diligence. When you build that team of accountants, lawyers, any resources I can tap into to get that lawyer on board, that accountant, start a due diligence process? Any suggestions where I could reach out to build that team?
They're all here. Try to avoid the tackles on the way to the door. And I'll let Michael answer that question or ask his own.
My favorite place to find the professionals that do the deals is Midwest Business Brokers Intermediaries. It's mbbi.org. Has a meeting every month by O'Hare and has one tomorrow morning at 8:30 in Oak Brook. My building, I'm sponsoring it. It's on the first floor, 1225 West 22nd Street. Starts at 8:30 sharp. So, but I wanted to comment about our valuations ever done on sales. You asked about, sir. I do a lot of deals as an M&A attorney and as a franchise attorney, and I once in a blue moon see a discounted cash flow. I see a lot of deals with the multiple of earnings, and I also see rules of thumb. And these are industry statistics that anybody in the particular industry just knows because they're in it. If you're going to buy an accounting practice, we already know the price. It's 1 or 1 1/4 times annual revenues. It's just what it is. If you're going to buy a hair salon, it's 1/3 of annual revenues plus the cost of the inventory. It's just what we do. There's a publication out there from Business Broker Press that has probably 200 or 400 of these rules of thumb. The ironic thing I found years ago is if you use the different methods of valuation, rules of thumb, discounted cash flows, multiples of earning, they kind of come out in the same ballpark. But if you're in the industry, you love the rules of thumb. So, thanks.
I'll also give you one story about venture capital financing. Polestar Ventures stepped out of the technology field about 10 years ago and bought a hog farm and tried to figure out what the significant number was. Well, they figured that out, and the hog to feed ratio, in other words, how many pounds of feed are you putting in to how many pounds of hog you get out, was a reasonable measure of value added day by day. As a Duke graduate and a North Carolina product, there's a lot of hog farms down there. And that may be something you decide to buy or sell sometime. All right, more questions. We have a comment on RMA statistics.
That was another source that, you might want to look at is RMA. The bankers all go to RMA to look at what statistical averages are for industries by size. And if we see something that you're presenting that's way out of whack from what we see on RMA, you know that you're going to have a gap between what you're looking for in financing and what we think something's worth. So you can, I think the SBDC has access to RMA. You used to be able to get it at libraries, so I don't know that you need a subscription to it, but that would be, I think, a good source to go to.
Naperville has it in their business books section, and so does Glen Ellen in their public library, and I believe COD does as well. Other questions, sir?
I'd just like to add a comment to the Midwest Business Broker meeting. I started in my process, my new store, a little over 3 years ago, and you have to be willing to admit to yourself you don't know what you don't know. And so the brokers, and that's where I met Michael, the accountants, the attorneys, the bankers, the different perspective they have and the different perspective they give, because they've done what they've done, to Michael's point, because they just know it. And when you don't know what you don't know, you better admit it quick. Because some of the deals are, the best deal is not do a deal at all. And I did a couple of those as well. So I just look to the experts. We've all been in industry, we've all been in business, we all know a lot. But you also have to admit you don't know what you don't know.
Other questions, other comments? We had a fellow used to run our Institute for Illinois Business Laws as our volunteer chair, and he would always conclude with what he called remarks for the good of the order, which meant whatever he wanted to say at the end of a meeting. I'm going to ask our panelists, any remarks for the good of the order, things that might sort of help people along as they consider buying, selling, or helping people do this. And we'll start with our last and move up to the first. John?
I think the only thing that stuck with me has been the how many didn't have a earnout question. And every private deal I've done had an earnout, and the public ones didn't. And so all of them.
Don't need one. You got to mark it out. Here you go, Colleen.
I would say that if you're going to approach a bank or any financier, have a number in mind. I cannot believe how many people still come and say a range. I want to borrow a range. And that don't have a plan, that don't, what is your equity in the deal? Do you have anything that you're putting in? How much do you want to borrow? Like, they'll do all this due diligence to figure out what to buy and not be prepared when they come in front of the bank. And you can only lose that credibility once.
Pat?
Whether you're buying or selling a business, plan, here we go again, plan for the sale. At the end of the day, the market is really active right now. It is unbelievably picking up in 2013, kind of where it left off in 2012. So there's a lot of deals out there. So I just encourage you, if you're thinking of doing something, plan appropriately 2, 3, 5 years out. Now's the time to do it.
And to piggyback onto what Colleen said about not having a range, the SBDC has this very very efficient tool called Profit Mastery that can take your business from where it is, take it to where you want to grow, and give you a quick and dirty as to what that plug number is going to be that you're going to need to go to the bank or to some investor to look for additional money for your deal. So there is a tool out there that's very quick, very dirty, but it gives you a number that's defensible in that. And my advice would be to proceed with caution. You've got a lot to lose.
And by SBDC, we mean the College of DuPage Small Business Development Center. Wayne is familiar with them as he has been a SCORE, which is Service Corps of Retired Executives volunteer. You can actually get free counseling from an experienced business person who may have some experience in your industry. Mind you, there are other consultants who can also talk about strategy. And looking for people with deep industry experience and with current M&A experience is very important. How you put your team together is up to you, but this is a competitive marketplace. If there are no more questions, I will thank you very much for coming. March 18th is on Finding Money for Your Deals. Rob, stand up. You're one of our speakers. Our other three are not here. Rob's going to talk about factoring and hard money and a company called Bibby, which has got $2 billion to deploy at this point. We have others. High Street Capital was one of our better speakers on the February program. He's got $135 million that he wants to deploy. Ron Kirshner has Heartland Angels. I'm not sure how many deals he's done, but I know he's seen 3,500 over the course of the last year and a half. So he will be able to tell you how your deal looks for angel financing versus others. And I have Mark Gross out of Wind Creek Financial out of Virginia that is advertising 3.98% or less on hard money real estate deals. How he is able to do that, it will be very interesting to listen to. Those aren't the only sources you could look at, but there's a lot of money around. So, see you next month, we hope. Thanks.